Hola, hello everybody. And wait, didn't we see this guy over streaming last week? Well, I didn't get enough. I am recording or reporting right now directly from PNSQC 2023 in Portland, Oregon. And here you will have an overload of presenters, gurus, speakers, and professionals that have been in the area for so long and that are so good. And speaking of, I have one of them with me today, our amigo Michael Larsen. Amigo Michael, how are you?
Hi everybody. I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me.
It's a blast always, and I think this is the conference when I finally met you in person.
I think so. Yes.
Last year.
Yes, correct.
And it is a blast to walk and you're one of the first faces that I see, known faces like, oh, amigo, how are you? It's always so good to be able to see you.
I'm tall. I stand out in the crowd.
That's true as well. Pretty tall, amigo. It's funny because for the people that do not see us in person, but only here on the screens, it is like, yeah, these guys must be just average or look short or stuff like that. Yeah, Michael is pretty tall.
It's funny. I have an interesting. This is just an A side, but I have an interesting build compared to a lot of people. So I'm 6'2", basically, somewhere
Pretty
between
tall.
6'2" and 6'3". I haven't measured in a long time, but when I was younger, I was close to 6'3". I'm probably closer to 6'2" now, just because of age and gravity.
Yeah, that happens.
But I have small legs, or short legs, for a guy my height. I have a 31-inch inseam, which makes buying clothes fascinating. But it also is funny when I'm talking with people, because I'll be standing in a hallway and I'll be talking to somebody who's my height, and we'll be staring at each other eye to eye. And then, hey, let's go sit down, or whatever reason. Then we'll sit down at a table, and the person that I'm talking to is the same height, is now half a head shorter than me.
Yeah.
And suddenly they're looking up at me and they're so confused. Like, wait,
what just happened? I get exactly the same, because short legs, short arms, big torso.
Yeah.
It's the same. I'm the opposite to a sloth. The sloths are long everything, but except the torso, I'm the opposite. So I think we're on gonna be similar level. But okay, so enough introductions, or not enough introductions. Amigo Michael, there's people who may not know you, not know what's the deal with you. Do you mind sharing what is the deal with you? What do you do?
Wow.
While you're
Okay.
Here?
Well, let's see.
Get ready for a story.
Oh boy. Well, to make things fairly direct, as of right now, currently, I am what you would refer to as a at-large tester, which means that for a number of years I've worked with one company, and because of reshuffling and stuff, I was let go from that. And so at this current point in time, I am working as a software testing consultant, primarily focusing on software training. And I'm teaching a cohort right now about how to use tools like C#, MS Test, and Unit, XUnit, and Microsoft Playwright. And the interesting thing is that I had a little bit of experience with a lot of those, but when they said, oh yeah, we're going to be covering Playwright, and I was a little frightened by that, because I haven't used that. And you want me to go into a class and teach that? Well, how long do we? I saw the list of that. Okay, I've got time. I can figure some stuff out with it. And I will tell you right now, if you ever want to know if you actually know something or how well you know something, try teaching it to other people and taking the time to walk through that process. You would be amazed, not just at how much you are learning from doing it, but also things that you took for granted, or you have to try something out. You can't just say, oh yeah, I sort of know that. Oh, or I'll get back to that. No, you know that on this given date, you have to talk about this particular topic, and it needs to be covered in depth. And you're going to be sitting in front of this class for 4 hours. So you have no place to hide. You can't just go, oh, I'll talk to you later about that. And sometimes you do realize somebody will ask you a question and I don't know about that. I will have to actually look that up. And you really do get to see how much of something you actually know or don't. And it's very educational. Let's put it that way.
It's said super entertaining. The Feynman method. Richard Feynman also had that saying, that to truly know if you understand the topic, if you can explain it, you're good. You can teach it, you can talk about it. And I think it's also like learning experience for yourself. You get the pressure because you gotta explain it.
Yeah, it's true.
You get to use it, and you get to be exposed in front of people. Like, ooh, this question. Always, when you get a question and you don't know, it's growth for you as well. I think
Absolutely.
it's
The biggest challenge, I think, to put it in perspective. So, and I don't want to call out too much details because again, it's a customer and
okay. No, we don't want
working for a
to
vendor and I don't want to
point lights and
point lights
anyone.
exactly. But interestingly, what I found interesting about this process was that first of all, there's 3 classes that are being taught, or 3 groups of people are being taught. One group of people is being taught with JavaScript and TypeScript, and that's a fairly big group. Second group is being taught with Java, and that's another fairly large group. What they needed was somebody to teach their C# and .NET group, and that's where I fell in. And my group is actually considerably smaller than the other classes. So you have some interesting challenges when you have a small class. On the plus side, you get to really focus on something and make sure everybody understands it, and you don't have that social loafing situation that happens. It's a lot harder to loaf when you have a small group of people because you can get around to everybody and give them a chance. When you have 15 or 20 people in a group, it's impossible to ask everybody, so you don't know if somebody doesn't understand. But the interesting thing is that when you have a small group, you tend to cover things fairly rapidly, or you get a chance to really drill down on something, and somebody in that class who might really know a bit but not a whole lot beyond that starts to ask questions or starts to really get in, and you can't shift to something else. You have to take care of it at that point in time. And so there were times I thought, okay, I don't know that as well, or let's try it.
Let's learn together.
Yeah, let's learn together. Let's go ahead and figure this out. And a couple of times I had to say, I'm not sure if that's going to work, or the solution that we're proposing might not work, but let's get a start with it. And as we play around and experiment, somebody might come up with an idea and go, hey, I think I know how I can work with that, or I can do something better with that.
I think that as well is a good exercise of group learning because, as you mentioned, the third actor will appear and probably that person knows or has an idea, and everyone gets together in this interaction and starts to learn. And some of the elements that you mentioned, like why specifically you going for C#, makes me wonder, like on your background, how, and that's a question that I like to smash on everyone a little bit here and there. How do you ended up in testing? How does, because the C# background and testing sounds weird to me, not everyone.
Okay, so first of all, the C# background was a recent development. It was actually a fairly recent development because of the company that I was working with prior. We had done all sorts of avenues for software testing for quite some time. I was working with Postman, an API, doing JavaScript stuff, and that was understandable and modern. And they said, well, we decided that because of our code base and customers, we're going to centralize on C#, .NET, XUnit type of a framework using Selenium, and also running native calls to API. And I thought, okay, how much did I know about C#? Not a lot, but I figured it's an object-oriented language. I've worked with object-oriented languages, so I could probably figure some stuff out. And I did, and I was able to go, okay, I think I see what's happening here. I worked with the logic that fit into XUnit, and so got fairly adept at that. You can argue, but enough to where I could be dangerous.
Yep.
And I was able to make tests on a fairly regular basis and say, here, I could check them in. Here's the next stuff that I did. Here's the API thing calls that we have. So I had experience with it. And then when I got let go from that job, because, well, that's what happened, a friend of mine reached out to me and said, hey, I'm looking for a trainer. I thought, okay, sure. What are you looking to train? He said, we're looking for somebody who can train C#. I said, I've worked with it. I've worked with it. I can probably, how much do we need to cover? Basics of C#, a fundamentals levels class, a kind of a 101 class, understanding of what unit testing frameworks are and how they fit together and why you would use them, examples of using them with C# code, understanding how to use Microsoft Playwright, And then we're going to do a capstone project where you'll actually use those skills to automate a project. I thought, I think I can do that. Let's go ahead.
It's awesome because when you were talking about you had already experience with object-oriented languages and some of these principles, to me it's like, yeah, I don't know, in a racing motorcycle, I could drive it, and then you got the question, can you drive a Harley? You're like, well, I've been in some other motorcycles, so probably I can learn where are the new pieces, and as long as you have the principle.
And the neat thing is, so this was something I thought was rather cool. For those who aren't familiar with, or if you, I'm just, to borrow from Leandro's talk, because we were talking about testing fallacies and the idea that if you have a hammer, of course, everything ends up being a nail and you work with the hammer for everything. Well, when I knew for a fact that I was going to be working with Playwright as the automation tool, and that was going to be our focus because the company decided that's what they wanted the C# and .NET team to work on, okay, I focused on that. And there was something that I discovered that was kind of cool in the sense that Playwright isn't just a Microsoft tool. Yes, they own it, but it was originally Puppeteer, and it was its own thing. And it has language bindings for Python, for JavaScript, for a few Java, a few other things out there. C#, yeah. And so the neat thing is just like Selenium has its IDE, Playwright has something very similar. It's called CodeGen. And so you can spin up CodeGen from the command line and have it there, and you can walk through your application, and it will capture your output, and it will capture your output and drop it out into the format that you want to use. So you can actually select, how do you want it to go out? Do you want to create an object library? Do you want to create
the type of projects that you can put together?
Yeah, whatever you can. So that was also helpful to realize, oh, I can take this, I can drop it in, and then I can run it linearly. And then you start to look at what you start to see patterns. Okay, how can I use those patterns? How can I step those out? Can I build up my page? And this is interesting. I saw somebody talking about this just yesterday, in fact, where they were commenting on the fact that we use the term page object model when we're talking about web applications. And it makes sense to do that because a lot of the interactions that we do are very similar. But the challenge you run into, and we've run into this challenge in this class, and it's been interesting to see how they've dealt with it. And this is the tricky part. Part of me is like, do I want to explain what should be done? Or do I want to just give the basics of what can be done and let's see what happens? And you'll see other groups and they'll do it differently. Some are very linear. They'll have a description of everything. They'll have a big block constant or something that they can use, and it points to an element, and it's pretty linear, but you can stack them together and use them and make your step-by-step scripts. On the other hand, some have looked at it and said, there's an awful lot of duplication in that. So how can we limit that
modularize functions?
How can we modularize it? And then you realize, well, you've made a page and you're calling your object of that page and then doing things, and then you find yourself someplace else. Now you have to call that page and all those functions, and then you go to someplace else. So you start to realize that, and again, I'm sure somebody out there is going to be listening to this, and they're going to go, oh my gosh, why are you doing that? Well, it's because that's how it's oftentimes presented.
Or on the other direction, because we'll be like, oh, I'm taking notes, like, what are you saying here that I could do? It depends, and we often, so damn often, get this question, like, what is the best practice, the best thing, or like, it depends.
And what I thought was clever, it's just a side comment that I saw on LinkedIn, and it's also neat that when you are dealing with these situations or you're trying to figure out what to do with these things, suddenly conversations that were just line chatter before, they just drop in your lap. Oh, this is really relevant now.
Yeah.
What are we talking about here? You start spinning up the thread and you start to see what people are discussing, and you're realizing this was not something I would have paid any attention to 2-3 months ago. And now it's something that's really important and really relevant to me. AI, exactly.
We're experiencing that. I think last PNSQC, Tariq was around talking about AI as usual. And some people paying attention. 1 month later, everyone wants AI stuff. And this happens as well in processes, how to automate the tools, the processes. You never know where the route is going to take. And something that I get a lot from what you are mentioning, like having these principles from some other areas, from other flows of thought, to call it in a way, can get you to interesting places so that you can fix a situation, have this, even present a course of training.
Yeah.
Uh,
And the point from this is that just 5 months ago, I was not actively involved in training at all. It wasn't something I was doing. And now it's,
but you had done it before,
but I've done
right?
it before. Oh, yeah, I've done tutorials and I've done course, classwork
You had
and
under
such.
your belt the
Yeah,
pedagogical
yeah,
principles
I knew how to do it, but I had never done it
in
in
that topic.
this level and this topic or for this length of time. So this is a fairly intensive program that this organization had put on. I actually came in at the 1/3 point because they had a whole testing fundamentals thing that they were doing. This is, I guess, the phrase that's common for this is called upskill.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that they're taking a number of people who are predominantly manual testers. And interestingly enough, people think there's manual testers out there still. Actually,
Yeah.
yes, there are.
You wouldn't believe how many people I ask that they are automators, they are presenting up here, blah,
Mm-hmm.
blah. And how did you start it? We're going to get to that in a moment. Uh, Manual testing. 90% of them is like manual testing. I started doing manual testing and then I got the principles
Mm-hmm.
and my mind wrapped around what is QA. And then I blazed through automation and starting
Yeah,
doing stuff, right?
and that's a very common pattern that people go through, in the sense that also the tricky part is you could be being hired to do automation, and yet you end up finding out that 75% of your work is doing manual testing
Mm-hmm.
anyway, with the hope that over time you will be able to lessen that and do more of the automation work. But sometimes you don't really get lessening because the work just keeps coming. Excuse me, sir. And because of that, what you end up seeing is that, yeah, you're still doing a tremendous amount of automation work, or you're starting to see there's areas that are resistant to automation or that you have challenges being able to interact with. So, well, I'll keep working on that and I'll get back to it. And sometimes it can be months or even years before you do get back to what that element is. So it's interesting to say that if you're going to upskill a group and you're going to work with them for that, you have to start with a number of foundations. You have to start with things like understanding pattern recognition, understanding where you find information, how you see what an element is, why that matters, why just looking for the text for something isn't sufficient.
Mm-hmm.
Or you might find yourself going, hey, I've automated everything and I've got all these labels down and it's great. And somebody flips the localization bit.
Oh, funny.
And now everything that you've automated is useless because it's
Completely.
focusing on these words, and the words now no longer appear in the DOM.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you do with that? Like, oh shoot, I can't use that. Well, got one of two choices. Either you and either you make a script that goes through and automatically logs in and goes and flips the localization bit
that.
so that you have that for your test. Don't be ashamed of that. If it works, it works.
Yeah.
Or the better way, of course, is to look to see, here's where the text is, what else defines it? Okay, is there anything in this area that is more uniquely defined by what's
Oh.
outside of it? So what you might end up having to do is making a building block chain of classes and element selectors so that it doesn't matter what the name of it is. If there's enough of a unique aspect to it, you can still call it. Or there might be some other ways of working with it. Incidentally, this was a trick that we used at the company I was at on one of the products we worked with to test localization so that we weren't at the mercy of the language itself. Because again, if you run localization and you have the words and you load your DOM, those words are gone. There's no reference to them. They're just going to load the French word, or they're going to load the Czech word, or fill in the blank. And if you are looking for an English descriptor that has that phrase in it, you're toast. It's just not going to work. So what they would do is they would actually show what text was going to be localized, and they would put it between two square brackets.
Yeah.
So whenever you saw 2 square brackets, you knew this is a string that will be subjected to localization. So at least in this point, you could say, I know that this is going to be something that's.
But that's very cool because you shift left a little bit and talked to developers and asked like, hey, can you put me these brackets so that we
Yeah. So at least
don't do this?
I know that this is going to be something that's going to change.
Mhm.
And so I'm not necessarily looking for what's in the brackets. I'm looking for the two brackets on both sides with whatever is located on the outside. Then I know that that's the element that I should be looking for. And that gives you a way out, and it gives you another angle to work. And I shouldn't say a way out, but
A way to work it out.
yeah, a way to work it out. Exactly.
Yeah, and I like a lot this perspective because you're giving several different approaches, like widening your object selection, like go one object above and see what everything is around it. So next time you can just specify what's the new name and not to go into that much trouble, or ask developers to make the code more testable with these little brackets that may sound silly, but make a huge difference when development take into account testers and the code is testable. That's a principle I remember I saw in Google. They have it. Everything, if your code is not testable, it's broken. And I love that perspective that you are not set to the book. There's no book, but as an example, and these are the path and the ways that we're going to do it. No, let's figure something out that is more efficient or adequate to our team or as the project is going. And that's, I see a lot of, for the record, I just gave a presentation on mental patterns and biases for testing. And I see, Michael, you are applying several different perspectives and yeah, thought experiments on how can we make these things work instead of just like follow it by the book. You cook, you don't have a recipe book for cooking. You cook from the heart and the brain, particularly like trying to figure out things. And going back to the question earlier, how did you get into all of this? What was your first QA project?
Oh,
Or,
wow. Okay.
I mean, going back a little bit.
So for anybody who doesn't know the test head story, by the way, mkltesthead.com, that's my blog. I've got a whole actual section. It's called Meandering, 10 years in the life of a software tester. When I wrote that, that was where I was at. It's actually needs to be updated now. Or 20 years, actually. It's now 30 years. But here's where this whole thing comes to play. I've always been a tinker, and I've always been somebody who loves mucking with stuff. But I'm not one who likes to build from the ground up. I don't know if this will make sense. I am honestly one of those people that if I had to sit down, I'm a musician and I enjoy writing music, I enjoy playing music, but I will be absolutely frank with you. If you sit me down with just my guitar, or you sit me down with a piano, or a blank sheet of music, or a program with nothing in it, and say, write me a song, I'm going to stare at that for an hour and I'm going to get frustrated because I struggle with getting started. There's a phrase I learned, there's two phrases that I learned a number of years ago. And again, I'm spacing on the name of the author, but I can tell you the name of the book. It's called Peak Learning.
Okay.
And in that book, the author made a point that there were two kinds of people. The first kind of a person is what's referred to as a stringer, or a component person,
Okay.
which means they're the kind of a person who, a component person is somebody who would be super happy with an unorganized set of Legos. They will go through and they will pick the things out and they'll just build something from the ground up, and they'll figure it out, and they'll go through in order to do that. That component level of thinking is where a lot of engineers and programmers do well. I don't do so well with that. In other words, just give me a bunch of unorganized stuff or give me an empty tool and say, run with this. I'm going to have a hard time getting started. I could do it, but it's harder for me, is what I'm saying.
A pre-built framework.
Yeah. On the other hand, yes, there's what we also refer to as groupers. And these are broad stereotypes, and I'm painting with a broad brush with this. But the idea of a grouper is there's somebody who likes to take something that's whole and break it down.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take something that's whole and you deconstruct it and you look for where the patterns are, well, then you can put it back together again. And if you're the kind of person who likes to take things apart and then build them back better or different or go in a different direction, that's where I find that I do much better. So I'm not the type of a person who is going to just sit down and say, I'm going to write a song. Again,
think I
the
see where
point
you're
of
getting
being
to.
a musician does have a lot to do with this, because that's what I did for many years. And my point with this is, I'm not the type of a person who's going to say, I'm going to write a song from scratch and it's going to be brilliant. But I'll hear a song, and as I'm listening to that song, I'll understand its structure. And I'll think, oh, okay, it's got a pretty neat intro. Hey,
But it needs
hold on a second. And it goes over
spicy.
here. It's got a little spice here.
Uh-huh.
This is over here. This is over here. Okay. And I have this thing I call a fishbone diagram that I use with songs,
Mm-hmm.
to where I'll start with it. If I find anything that I notice repeats in songs, or it's very, it will come down into a circle, and if I repeat it, I'll just come back around to it. I'll know it's it, or I'll have a ray that points out to something unique. And over time, I have these structure diagrams, and I'll keep those, because later on I can always call on them. Or there are certain chord progressions that will just show up in everything.
Yeah.
Axis of Awesome shows that there's these 4 chords that are used all the time, and they show up in hundreds, if not thousands, of hit songs.
Yep.
So, okay, if you know what that chord progression is, all right, that's what everybody's going to use. Okay, but at least I know it's there. Here's a handful of chord progressions I know that are pretty popular, that I like using. An example of this was, I was using a descending Andalusian cadence that I found really interesting. That's where you start with the tonic and go to the flat 7th, the flat 6th, and the flat 5th. It just makes this neat movement.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does my knowing that that's an Andalusian cadence mean anything? Not really. By itself, it's not important. But if I take one of my fishbone diagrams, I take an Andalusian cadence, I pick a key, and then I pick a mode or a scale. Now I've got something to work with. And now I can group those things together, and I can start working with and processing them and make a song out of it.
I am seeing here a pattern from what you're saying, software already being done, and for quality in the end, just adding those
sometimes
last
yeah
touches.
So there is a reason for this. For many years, first off, I was young when I was primarily doing music, so I was either just out of high school or I was in college. And after a number of years, I had an interesting situation. I had a band that was in a prime position. We were doing well as a group,
Mm-hmm.
or at least I thought we were doing well. We were playing to a lot of people, but we just weren't making a lot of money. And I was going to school part-time, working part-time, being in a band part-time. And when you do everything part-time, you don't get good at anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided at this point, I had to go in and I had to commit to being the musician, which meant I had to drop out of school, which meant I was violating my parents' rule. I could live rent-free as long as I was going to school.
Okay.
And if I wasn't going to school, that rule didn't apply anymore. And I realized, if I'm going to have to be paying for rent, I might as well go into San Francisco and live around my bandmates and be close to them and do the things I'm doing. When that was a lot more affordable, by the way.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, nothing that you can do nowadays. But
I tell this to my kids and they want to punch me.
say what?
But because it was a big deal for me at the time, but I was able to negotiate. I rented out a dining room in a small house in the Sunset District of San Francisco, and didn't have a closet. It didn't have much in the way of privacy either, but it did have a door, thankfully. But I paid $300 a month for that. Now, mind you, in 1990, $300 a month for a small room in a house, that meant you extracted it out of a 4-bedroom house plus a.
I mean, still inflation and adjusted.
Yeah,
It's
just
under
for inflation.
1,000
Yeah,
today.
I would be paying something in the neighborhood of like $1,300 to rent a dining room, which sounds a little more like today. Okay, kind of, but
I think it's kind of cheap if you still.
It's still
say
cheap.
San
It's still cheap.
Francisco.
Yeah, for San Francisco, it's still cheap. Absolutely. But my point is that put me in a very different dynamic to where it's like I can't get by on just cleaning houses or
literally I can't afford to do
I
this.
can't afford to do this unless I get something more oomph. And my drummer, who worked with Toa Electronics, he was the sales rep and the whole bit. He was doing great. He said, "Oh, just go to the temp agency I worked with. They got me positioned at Toa a couple of years ago, and I moved up through that, and not a big deal." Okay, sure. Went in, explained some of the things that I did, explained some of my music stuff, explained that I was the person who managed our band's mailing list, and I had our finances on Lotus 123, and we had a DBase 4 database that we were working with, and I was using WordPerfect and Illustrator, to do band flyers and stuff like that. I didn't know if that was worth anything, though. It just seemed like pretty
Cool.
pedestrian stuff to me. As nobody's going to care about this. And don't be so sure. And the funny thing was that they called me back and they said, we've got a possible job for you. It's not glamorous and it's not long term. They need somebody for a few weeks to literally clean out their engineering library and organize things. As a housekeeper, I can do that. Where is it? Well, it's down in Menlo Park. Oh, that's a haul, but okay. It's only for a few weeks. I can live with it. That's fine. Who's the company? It's a little computer company. They got let's see. Oh, they're called Cisco Systems.
Oh, tiny. Yeah.
Now, mind you, in March of 1991, unless you were really part of the internetworking space or understood what internetworking was, very few people knew who Cisco Systems were. They were
not small.
They were not small, but they were not what they would become.
10 years later, they blew out.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
Internet. Yeah.
So I just said, okay, cool. Sure, I'll go down and clean the engineering library. That's something I could do. And I did it way quicker than they anticipated because, again, I'd been a housekeeper for a number of years. That's something I could do, my eyes closed. And so they had me contracted for several weeks. And they thought, well, since we're contracted for these, multiple weeks, what are we going to do? Or how can we handle this? And so when they heard that, somebody had said, hey, can I borrow him, please? Because I could absolutely use some help. And that was my soon-to-be friend, Shanna, who ran the release lab for the build and test group for Cisco Systems. And I was just chatting with her and showing her some of what I knew. And as I was explaining some things, she walked me into her lab and showed me around and explaining what the equipment was. And as I was looking at the equipment, I was just mentally taking notes. I saw patch panels, I saw wires going, and I saw computers on one side of the room and on the other side of the room. And I realized she had spatially placed things so that you could actually work in a lab setting. And I was able to pick this up and say, oh, so these machines over here can go talk to these machines over here. And all this stuff that's in between is the infrastructure. And you have so mentally I'm saying to myself, this is like
you're talking about
studio.
An amp and the mixer is here.
This is like a recording studio with different wire. And as I was talking to her about it, and I said, let me just ask you a question. If I wanted to take this machine over here and I wanted to talk to that machine over here, could I basically wire that up for you? And she said, I could, no, seriously. Could I wire that up? Let me just, because I was curious. I said, let me see what happens.
Let me try it.
She said, yeah, let me try it. Sure, okay, well, hold on. So I walked over. Okay, we've got a well, I didn't know what it was. I just knew it was a
RJ45.
RJ45 or something, or a coax cable coming from this. All right, that's coming into this. Okay, I see there's this machine here. And I'm following a cable. It's coming. Oh, there's a patch panel. All right, so this is a patch panel here. And if I look, and I'm just looking to see some other examples, I said, plug, 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 plug. So, and I asked a couple of questions too, because I didn't know exactly what a router was or how to configure it, but I could look to see what was plugging into things and make sense and go, okay, this is an interface. It plugs into this interface. That interface plugs into this module, which goes over here, and watching the steps, and it connects over to another computer. Okay, how would I do this? What would I do? And through that conversation, she then went to the director of engineering for the release engineering group and said, if he's got time, can we borrow him? I think this would be useful. And so said, the engineering director asked me and said, hey, would you be interested in working with the testing, with this group for a while? We have a project that's always been sort of a scuttlebutt thing that nobody's really done, and we've done it in our spare time, but I think this might be a good opportunity. Would you like to do it? I said, sure, tell me what's up. And so they introduced me to what was called a BITEC programmer, an EEPROM programmer. They set it down here, and there was a terminal attached to it. And they said, we use Unix. Do you use Unix? I said, no. I've used DOS. I've used Mac OS or Mac, Windows stuff.
Whichever was under there.
But I have used DOS, so I'm guessing I could probably understand. Do you have commands and files, and you do stuff with those, and you run programs? Yeah. Okay, I can probably figure it out. So here's the string, and here's what we do, and here's how you access this. There's a file on the network and all this, and then you hit enter and you run it. And I saw it, and I was able to go, at first just writing things down, making sure I understood it. And then they said, and then we have this bucket. And it was just, if you looked at this, you would just cry, because it was this huge bucket, like a 5-gallon water bottle at the top cut off, filled with EEPROMs that were not in foam. They were just thrown in there. Oh, yeah. Well, the point was these were for test images, so it didn't matter as much.
Okay.
But they said,
feel bad.
it was very, when I realized, this looks not good. But they said, yeah, you do want to ground yourself, and you want to be on a floor that's this purposes. So my job for the next several weeks was to go through and take these EEPROMs and strip the paper off of it and put them in a tray and put them in an ultraviolet machine to erase them, and then put them in the BITEC and make sure that they were erased, and then see if I could reprogram them. And if I couldn't reprogram them, I pitched the EEPROM. If I could, we kept them. And then this big bucket slowly dwindled to rows of neat, nicely crimped. I went through and I straightened out the legs and all that. But because of that, I started to learn how this process worked, what it was they were doing, and how test images got put into boards, and then what the basic, they had like 5 commands you had to run. Run show version, show interface, show hardware, show what other things are, show the routing table, and then ping an interface. Just those commands. And so if I could do those, if I could do that smoke test, then those EEPROMs were good enough to be sent on to one of the actual testers to do real stuff with. But they weren't going to waste the real tester's time with having to program all that, because it took a long time to do at that point. And they had other things they had to focus on. So somebody has to be the grunt. And I said, sure, I'll be the grunt. Fine.
And it sounded like at the same time you were having fun. It was something
and it was neat. It was fun. It was interesting.
Was a learning experience, a paid learning experience, which is, I think, one of the best ones. I think with this, you are kind of giving a very good, because many times it's like we are not in that position that we cannot afford to have some of those paid experiences. When we are just starting in those ages, it's awesome. You can mess things up. You can have mistakes. But I'm the intern. I'm just borrowed here, and I don't care, or you shouldn't care. Why do you give me this business critical task if I am just a new guy playing with things?
And the cool thing was that after doing this for a bit, and I figured, okay, I'm probably going to run out my time on this, they brought me back again. They said, hey, we think this, would you be interested in doing this for a longer period of time as a temp contract? And maybe it will convert to being a full-time gig. Who knows? But the real thing that got me interested in this, and this is a story I've told a few times, so for anybody who's heard this before, repeat, but if you don't know who I am, here's the true origin story of the test head. When I got to Cisco Systems, mind you, I was a musician at the time, and so I had long hair, and I was like part of the glam hard rock heavy metal scene in San Francisco at that time. That was my life. That was everything to me. So any job where I had to think about cutting my hair or doing any of that was not an option for me. Out of the question. And a number of jobs were like, don't cut your hair. Nope, you're not going to get hired. I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'm not going to do that. I walked into Cisco and I saw all of these very interesting looking people, like deadheads with big long hair and beards and tie-dye t-shirts and Guatemala sandals and just
sandals and Hawaiian shirt.
Totally this very different vibe. And I was amazed.
You felt at home.
I was not just at home, but I'd never seen a work environment like this.
Yeah.
And one of the administrative assistants who had first brought me in and was interviewing around, I went up to her and I said, who are these people that are
Peculiar.
able to do this? Who are these? I said, oh, those are our engineers. That's our engineering team. I thought, they're allowed to come to work like that? And this is the statement that cemented it for me. She said, honey, they make our product. They can do pretty much anything they want to. That was it.
Backbone of the company. You cannot mess with
when
that.
I heard that, I just said, I don't care what this company does. I don't care what this company makes as long as it's not illegal. I don't even know what industry this is or what business this is or what this all fits into. I have to work here. I have to work here.
You kind of fell in love right away.
Yeah, in a way I did. I fell in love with the culture.
Uh-huh.
Now let's borrow some of what Selena was mentioning about improvement and the whole option for you start with the culture element first. If the culture...
Go for it.
Go ahead.
Don't worry.
Yeah,
we're on a public space. Sorry if you see people walking.
So my point is, if the culture
we need to run.
is something that you love, then you're going to be very interested and adamant about doing something with it. And then the processes and the things that you do come later. So the reason, but that, I didn't really have something that I was passionate about. I'd worked lots of jobby jobs just because, but suddenly I was in an environment where the culture felt great, the people were cool, and they were working on something interesting and challenging. And now I had something to sink my teeth into.
You had your mix, and
and I
found yourself in a tribe of your own that felt good, doing interesting stuff. I think those recommendations are great for whoever is thinking, and that's also why I generally ask, where is the beginning, the origin story, this radioactive test that beat you, or in your case, it sounds like it was a router connecting some big
it was the combination of recognizing that a networking lab and a recording studio were not far removed from each other, that coding and making music had a lot of things in common. I did, of course, realize that testing, the manual exploratory elements of testing, had a lot more to do with that grouper mentality that I suggested, rather than the component stringer mentality. And that's not to say you can't be one or the other, but I'm saying that I think that there are probably better and more fun aspects of testing if you are a grouper than if you are a stringer, per se. If you want to do the component level stuff, automation is a beautiful thing. But if you really like doing the hands-on, getting into the guts and figuring things out, it helps if you're one of those people who likes taking a whole and breaking it down and putting it back together. And that's me. And that's where I mostly find my fun and my just digging into stuff.
And I take it as a recommendation for anyone watching. By the way, I see Peter Fieldhasi. Hola, Peter, amigo. Sad to not to see you here this time, but these recommendations, like when you can find a place for you that is entertaining, challenging, welcoming, and feels good, I think it's super valuable for anyone trying to start on the testing scene and or want to improve in it. I think these experiences that you shared are really valuable, and I would like to give you the chance. You already kind of pitched a little bit for quickly. Ronald Gross, was it the book that you mentioned?
Peak Learning,
yes. By Ronald Gross, because I always get this question: what was the book that Peak Learning by Ronald Gross? And
there's a lot more in that book beyond just those two concepts.
But it sounds like it's a
but those concepts were two very key ones that I found very interesting. So I want to make sure that we include that.
So, and as we're ramping down, about to be done, we extended happily a little bit. But amigo Michael, if people want to get in touch with you or follow up on what you are doing or read what you have done, because you already hinted a few things, where can they find you?
Okay, so the easiest place to find me is I have a blog. It's called Testhead. TESTHEAD, and right now I'm actually live. Testhead.com, yes, MKL Testhead, I should say, because Testhead.com is owned by some company that refuses to sell it, and so I just put my initials in front of it. And
MKL,
Testhead.com is how you get to it. That's my blog, and I've been running it for about 13 years. a little less recently, just because honestly, a lot of the topics I've already covered, but I'll probably will go back and start covering some of the stuff again. A lot of the material that I've just recently done for the training that I did, there's some lessons I've learned from that. So I'm going to probably be doing a series based around that. So if the idea of looking at learning a bit of C#, .NET, unit testing frameworks, and Playwright interests you, that's going to be coming soon. I also have an interest and an avocation with accessibility, because that's something that I got bit by about 10 years ago. And in the process of that, kind of fell in love with that aspect of testing. And so I do fairly write a bit about that. I speak about that. I also have, if you go to YouTube and if you do a search for Test Head Talks, TESTHEAD Talks.
Test Head together, one word.
Yeah.
Talks.
That has I think a listing of all the presentations, at least that I'm aware of, that are available on YouTube that I have spoken as part of or I've been the speaker for. So you can get your take on anything that I talk about, and you can decide this is somebody I would relate to or I'd like to know more about, or you can say I've had quite enough of that, man, moving on. And both are fine.
That's awesome, and a very good amount of places where people, if you want to find more about Michael, his talks, usability. I remember, is it this year your talk around usability, or
I did a talk about testability.
Testability.
Yeah. Is it testable?
I remember because that's on those lines. Is it made to be tested? And it's super important. But there you have it. If you want to get in touch, find out what Michael is doing, what he has done, some of the talks, take a look at the links that were mentioned. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up for now. Amigo Michael, thank you so much for coming and sharing.
Thank you.
It's such a pleasure. And everyone, this is the first day of PNSQC 2023 here in Portland, Oregon. I am looking at a lot of professionals here, similar to Michael, that are going to come and share the adventures, the testing adventures of a lifetime, many. And stay tuned. It has just begun. Again, Peter, hello, and hello to everybody else watching. And if you're watching in the future, hope you get a blast of these recordings. Michael, again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Adios, everyone. Adios. Because
Bye.
we are logging off on the stream because, I always have some trouble.